Everyone ready? We're on the air.
Recycled asphalt.
So I will call the Town of Londonderry Planning Board meeting to order for September 8th, 2021.
Compensates, moves the radical weed.
And I just want to point out for everyone who is here, this room has two exits. On the right-hand side of the audience, the front of the room, and the back of the room. If we need to evacuate for any reason, we ask you to proceed through the exit that's closest to you, move outside, and move away from the building, and don't come back into our fire officials have been instructed us to do so. I'd like to ask everyone to please rise. We'll pledge allegiance to the American flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, Chris is not here tonight. I'll appoint Roger to vote for Chris. And I haven't seen Bruce and I haven't seen Jason, so we do have 8 voting members. That is more than a quorum, and we can proceed with our meeting. And tonight we have workshop night. And first thing before we get to our other business is we have no minutes to approve under administrative board work. We have no regional impact determinations, and we have discussions with town staff. And I think you've got an item, Colleen.
Yeah, yep, the only item I have, we do have a request for an extension to satisfy the conditions of approval. This is the Sheffield Estates Elderly Housing Condominium Development that was conditionally approved on May 12th, 2021. The applicant has made progress towards addressing the final engineering review. They've done one full round of engineering review and have now submitted additional comments that have addressed 99% of our comments. The only outstanding item at this point is finalizing their alteration of terrain permit from DE, and the understanding is that that's in process with DES. So because that is the only pending item, staff would recommend granting the requested extension. They've asked for an additional 90 days, which would give them until December 8th, 2021 to meet the conditions of approval.
So they think they can meet them by December 8th?
That's what they've indicated.
Okay. I'll take a motion.
So move to grant the extension until December 8th.
Second?
And second by Jake. And is there any discussion by the board? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Abstentions? And chair votes affirmative. Motion carries, and Sheffield Estates has till December 8th, 2021 to meet all the conditions of approval. And we got Bruce here. Actually, we've got a full house now. Hasn't happened in a while, so. Any further material from staff?
That's all I have for staff.
John?
Nothing.
Things are going good?
Yep.
And anything from the board? I just want to mention that the Municipal Association is having a information and training session. It's an all-day event on Saturday, the 18th of September. If anyone's interested, please let me know. I'll send information out. There is a fee for it, but we'll see what we can do about the fee. And is all I have, so we'll proceed to our other business. The first item we have is Groundwater Protection. We have Pierce Rigrod from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, and this is regarding drinking water and groundwater protection.
So just by way of introduction, so we do have Pierce Rigrod via Zoom to provide a presentation to the board. As you know, we last month began to take a look at the state's model groundwater protection ordinance. Some questions came up from the board about the model ordinance and about what the town can be doing, it could be considering it in terms of adopting this this type of model ordinance, and other questions and comments about aquifers and aquifer protection and groundwater protection. So we thought it would be a great opportunity to have Pierce provide some background and some information. So with that said, Pierce, I'll hand it over to you. Just let me know if you have any trouble hearing us. We've kind of got the camera set up, but I'm going to try to mute us, and so we can stay quiet and just let you make your presentation until we have some questions.
Great, thanks, Colleen. Can you hear me okay? I'm about to share my screen using the presentation.
I can hear you. I'll check, make
Probably,
sure you've got a volume
maybe give a
turned
little
up.
more volume. I can hear okay. I don't know if,
All right.
Great, thank you.
there, that's
So,
good.
I hope everybody can see my screen at the moment. If you can't, please let me know.
We're not seeing it yet.
Okay. Let's try it again. Hold on.
There we go.
How about now? Okay, great.
Yep.
So I'll maximize the screen. So now you should see just the first slide.
Yes.
Thanks again, Colleen, and to the boards to invite me today to talk a little bit about the model groundwater ordinance that DES has promoted and designed and promoted over the last 15 or so years. This has been a document that has been fairly widely used by a number of communities across the state. I'm going to run through, as Colleen had mentioned, there were some questions. I guess you had reviewed this once before. And so I'm going to run through the model ordinance kind of section by section. I'm going to kind of also present some information just about design concepts, which many of you might be familiar with, that help to promote both the protection of groundwater, both its availability and quality, that planners and planning in New Hampshire can take advantage of. And most of it, I think you may be familiar with in some respects. And so I'll run through that. And I think this can be pretty informal, but I'm not sure if I'll see you. If we can wait till the end to do questions, or if someone really has a question, wants to pursue, an answer while I'm speaking, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, I think since something's pending, we can, I'll take the question. But normally what we'll do, we'll take input from, the presenter, and then we'll go through the planning board, and we have some members of the Conservation Commission here also, and we'll have them, ask any questions, comments. So I guess for the most part, we'll do it afterwards, but if someone really wants a question answered, just raise your hand, please.
And Pierce, we'll mute ourselves for now, but we'll use the raise hand tool if there's something urgent that we need to stop you and ask a question.
Okay. So
Thanks.
One thing I
if
had,
I don't see the raised hand tool, just please.
We'll
let me
pop
know.
in. Sounds good. Thanks, Pierce.
All right, so, we have a lot of water supplies in the state, a lot of public water systems. We have nearly 3,000 both wells and a very small number of intakes in reservoirs and in lakes and streams and rivers. Most of them are wells. Most people probably don't have a good sense of what kind of protection is in place around their water supply. And for public water systems in New Hampshire, most of them fall into the category that's in that first group of the bottom of this chart is showing the percentage of watershed area or wellhead protection area protected by land conservation. So basically, in some communities 100 years ago, a town may have decided to buy a significant amount of land around their watershed, or around their well. So if you're looking at this chart of the 3,000 water supplies that we have in the state, most of that land conservation protection is under 25% or less. And as you get into those higher percentages of the watershed land conservation or the wellhead protection area, which is the area that drains water to a community water supply well, those percentages fall greatly. So 3/4 of the area around a well and intake are not really conserved by land through land conservation measures. So that's really left to more of a land management perspective or a protection approach in New Hampshire. So we have to manage the land in a way that continues to preserve the availability and quality of our water supplies in our state.
yes.
It's always too.
So just a little bit, the district, the model ordinance is crafted as an overlay district to be adopted as such and to take I'll explain some of the district definitions that we've used and that we've promoted that refer to technical documents or technical delineations. Generally speaking, it limits a few higher risk land uses and establishes performance standards for other uses, and that's again taking the approach that we have a large part of our state that's actually in some form of a that's contributing water to a water supply, whether it's a wellhead protection area or a watershed. So this approach has been sort of accepted and used by a number of communities, in part, I think, because of the flexibility it affords. This particular ordinance includes, if you've read the document, it has a number of helps and rule citations to help you through the process of kind of thinking it through and how it might apply to your community and looking back at the state statutes and rules that already exist in New Hampshire. And you can find it on our website pretty easily, although we've just redone our website. I think if you do go to DES and you search, which I did a few minutes ago, you will come up with the document. So, as I said, this has been published for over 15 years. We have about 106 communities in the state that have taken advantage and adopted some form of municipal zoning that protects an aquifer and or a groundwater, a wellhead protection area, typically through some type of a zoning district. The map to the left shows those areas that have adopted the model or a version of, not necessarily the model ordinance, but an ordinance. Many of them do refer to the language and use the language in their model. And so probably the argument for doing this is that as we've continued to use various chemicals in our life, and the way that we use them can create problems in our water supplies, perhaps unintended, including perfluorinated substances, MTBE, 1,4-dioxane, which are commonly used in a wide variety of commercial products these days. MTBE is not used. It was gasoline. If you're not familiar with that chemical, it was an oxygenant used in gasoline in the 90s, but has become, all of these chemicals are fairly widely used. And so as we go along in progress that we make for the chemicals we use, some of these chemicals can be problematic and create an additional stress on trying to keep water supplies safe. And the direction in which this is going has certainly changed over the last 20 to 40 years. This graph is showing the number of contaminants regulated by EPA since the 1920s, and you can see that chart has grown substantially since 1990. And some of those chemicals I just mentioned are the chemicals we're currently struggling with to ensure that our drinking water and our source water resources are safe to use and healthy to use over the long term. And we've really come a long way in the last 40 years in knowing what these some of these chemicals may do in terms of our health, and also we have improved lab analytical methods that and detection capabilities that can are measuring these chemicals in the parts per trillion now. So, for instance, 1,4-dioxane, which was is present in a number of sites currently at DES that we're aware of, was a stabilizer for chlorinated solvents, including paint strippers, dyes. It's been used in degreasers and varnishes. These are the types of commercial products that are used both by homeowners and both commercially, and are in fairly wide use. So really the long view for planners and planning is to maximize clean recharge of surface water to the ground, prevent the release of contaminants from land use activities that as much as we can, and ensure that we have the long-term availability of our drinking water. Something that seems fairly straightforward, but is pretty hard to do in practice. So each community has its own story, its own issue with groundwater contamination, if you've been tracking these types of issues over time, you know that this can have a significant impact not only on the environment or public health, but on property values and the economy. Certainly there are places where, 10 or 15 years ago when I joined the agency and we were in the midst of trying to work with the salvage yard industry to kind of bring that industry back to, in line with sort of modern techniques of managing substances like oils and gases and radiator fluid and transmission fluid, and many of those property owners, suffered loss of property value due to the environmental liabilities that were left in the ground and were in the ground. So that's certainly a factor, as well as public health and environment. And so municipalities have, as you know, fairly wide latitude to control land use and make those decisions as to what land uses go where and what's best for in terms of protecting groundwater or protecting other resources. So the question, I guess, is, what is it that we have in our laws about reasonable water use? And there's a whole line of common law that allows reasonable use of water by property owners. We have standards in our state, not just about using, but about what quality of water in our groundwater needs to be maintained. And the citation to our rules, WMOR, essentially includes a table of about 100 contaminants that, once those contaminants are above a certain threshold, become enforceable action by our department and in terms of cleaning and reducing that contamination below the standards. We also have drinking water standards, which are not the same necessarily as ambient groundwater quality standards. They can be the same, but they can also be different. And those drinking water standards are based on health-based studies, like the one we just did a few years ago to lower the arsenic standard from 10 parts per billion to 5. And so those standards for drinking water tend to be, usually are actually set by EPA, although states also have a joint ability to set those standards as to what is safe for the long term for drinking water for public water systems. And I probably should note that there are no state standards that are spelled out explicitly as to what water quality for private wells must be. So I'm going to run through just a few slides about the sections. I won't dwell on these too much. I'm sure as the planning board or conservation, some of these statutes that are control how communities can plan or have authority over both planning and for groundwater protection. But generally the planning statutes, 674, are involved. In terms of public health, there are several statutes, including 31, 39, and 147, that give pretty broad authority to towns about protecting public health, that go to the water quality and protecting drinking water. And I believe in our model, we cite RSA 674-16, which is relative to the innovative land use authorities. So the objectives and the purpose of the model is really primarily to protect public health and try to meet and maintain the ambient groundwater standards, which again, these ambient groundwater standards typically are related to health, but not necessarily, and also achieve sustainable water supplies for communities. Just a note about private wells in Londonderry. As I mentioned, there's no testing or treatment requirements at the state level, which is very different than our public water supply wells, which are under regular monitoring and requirements for treatment when they exceed maximum contaminant levels set by the state or by EPA. I can talk more about this in a little bit, but I just wanted to make it clear that public and private wells are treated much differently in New Hampshire, and these are the household domestic wells, in which I believe in Londonderry there's approximately, I think I had the number, maybe I might get it wrong, 9,000 or 15,000 people, I think, who rely on private have to contend with growth. Growth involves change and changes in land use. As many of you know, this is kind of an outdated graphic, but Rockingham County and the seacoasts tend to garner most of the development, and we're probably the first line of handling that kind of development, and that certainly has an impact on water supply and water quality. There are a number of activities that are not conducive to maintaining or reducing the risk of contamination, and DES works as best as we can along with our partners to minimize contamination in the ways that we can through technical assistance, financial assistance, and other ways that we support the reduction of contaminants making their way into ground or into our surface water supplies. And so many of you know there's just a number of ways that certain contaminants can affect water quality, whether it's nutrients, pesticides, certain types of organic material, microorganisms or pathogens, metals and salts all have some type of potential to affect your water quality, and they also have certain types of treatment or certain types of controls that are helpful to to minimizing release. For instance, nutrients, the Department of Agriculture has its own set of practices that they have authority to require farms and agricultural interests to follow if they're not following accepted practices for, say, nutrient spreading, like farms spreading manure, things of that nature, or controlling it through structural control. So we've, and I think part of the whole story with source water protection and drinking water protection kind of begins with, probably 30 or 40 years ago when our state was in the midst of having a number of wells, large community sources that were being lost to contamination. In Milford's case, the Savage Well in the western part of town became a Superfund site. It was one of the largest, most productive aquifers in that town, actually in that part of the state, and that was due to the illegal dumping of trichloroethylene, which has been and continues to be a multi-million-dollar sort of cost associated with cleaning the aquifer, pumping and treating the aquifer. So there are these examples that kind of were precipitated a lot of activity both at the state level through the Groundwater Protection Act and subsequently through a number of local efforts through zoning and other ways to minimize contamination. So as you know, when you develop a new, whatever you're developing can include a number of risks, whether it's impervious cover, spills, other types of releases of chemicals and wastewater. There's a whole variety of things that require management or can require management. And in many of these cases, a lot of these industries have their own sets of best practices, and DES also has its own guidance on a number of these topics that I'm just listing out for you, but many of you know that there are these potentials when you have certain land uses that create changes to the hydrography, to how water is either infiltrated or runs off, and what it's catching in terms of contaminants. So DES has for a long time used wellhead protection areas as a way to define where to focus protection. So in this case, the red line is showing a technical hydrogeological study that was used to create, or was referred to, I should say, by a town to use to define its wellhead protection area. So these boundaries are technical in the sense that they're using a hydrogeo approach, geological study, or it might be a field study, it might be a desktop analysis, but they tend to be well supported in the courts and and defensible. So that's why we refer to them in our model. And so the language in the model refers to wellhead protection areas. And so probably one thing I've seen a lot of to avoid if you're going to go down this this road is to not refer to a specific fixed map. Many communities do that, and unfortunately, especially if you're talking about wellhead protection areas, those wellhead protection areas can change over time. Maps can get lost. There's oftentimes some not great clarity sometimes between when the map differs from the language. So avoiding reference to a specific map dated at a certain time is probably a good idea. So we also refer to hydro aquifers using, you probably have seen before these USGS water resource investigation reports that show transmissivity, which is the ability of ground essentially to hold water and transmit water. And those reports are also used to define stratified drift aquifers. So between the wellhead protection areas and these USGS reports that define stratified drift aquifers, those two tend to be what most communities use to define groundwater areas to protect, unless they do additional hydrogeological studies and reports that might be related to a new well. And we have some guidance on how to craft that language. Oops. So in Londonderry, I think this was what that would look like if you were to, I think you probably have seen this map before, but the dark areas are the stratified drift aquifer, and the yellow areas would be where there are wellhead protection areas. So if you were to define the zoning and using just those two, that would be the area subject to rules that would be adopted under that overlay district. So, as I mentioned, the ordinance takes an approach of eliminating, prohibiting high-risk uses. So these are the uses that we at the agency have over time kind of found to be those that are pretty inconsistent with water supplies and with protecting public water supplies particularly, so hazardous waste disposal sites, solid waste, outdoor road salt, salvage yards, snow dumps, wastewater septic lagoons, petroleum bulk storage plants, and gas stations. So basically, many of these sites often have groundwater remediation going on because they are inherently somewhat difficult to control in terms of contaminants being released to groundwater. This list can grow, it could be bigger. There's other uses that in your community that might be problematic, or other things that we have listed in the appendix of this document that go beyond these eight, but these were the ones that we decided were most important to limit. And everything else kind of falls into this management bin or area where we are suggesting, and the language within the ordinance is really performance-based. So it's all about how well what we are calling regulated substances are managed under state rules. So this is where state rules kind of interface with local zoning. So in the model, there is reference to regulated substances, which is a term that fits into END DW 401, which is the best management practices for protecting groundwater. And it's a state rule which we administer. And so those rules require things like secondary containment for large storage areas. It requires spill controls. It requires certain types of transfer of materials, fuels, for instance, from one container to the other, and other practices that are designed to minimize release to the environment. So these could be structural controls, referred to as source controls in some cases, or they can be operational practices that people that run those facilities must do. So in terms of things like housekeeping, and if you're, what I mean by that is if you're transferring fuels outside on a concrete pad and you're cleaning that up, you're cleaning up any chemicals or substances that you've accidentally spilled, and that you're not letting those, or you have structural controls that limit them from making their way into the ground, discharging to the ground. The model includes a minimum or a percentage rather of the site that becomes impervious, after which a stormwater plan is required, and it's 15% or more than 2,500 square feet of impervious it prohibits infiltration through known contaminated areas, so that if there are areas that are either in the process of being cleaned up or are known to be contaminated, that would limit any kind of stormwater or other infiltration being directed in that area. And so the ordinance refers and has language that really is very similar to the language in the state rules. So we have in our state thousands of documented spills and releases, in part due to poor management on sites. Sometimes this could be, in this picture you're seeing, someone's got gasoline kind of propped up outside, and they've got a hose that they're taking and kind of, transferring it over a dirt area. That's probably not the best setup, and the rules and the language in this zoning ordinance would limit this type of setup. So it would also require that any facility that uses a certain amount of a regulated substance in the amounts of storing more than 100 gallons or 800 pounds of regulated substance would be required to have a spill prevention, control, and countermeasure plan. This is this would be well below what the federal requirements are for similar plans at larger facilities. And it requires local review of these types of plans to make sure that you're comfortable with the setup and the arrangement of how these substances are being used on site. Typically, a local review could go to a fire chief, fire department, who could also look at it from a safety perspective as well as environmental perspective. So some of these things that are controls are pretty straightforward. It might be around the edge of a concrete area where someone's using a gasoline dispenser, a concrete pad with some what are called positive limiting barriers. These are basically the things you see at gas stations that are like they're grooves in the end of a concrete pad, and they catch about 10 or 15 gallons of gasoline or something, and it depends on the actual design, but it can catch, an incidental spill at a dispensary. Things just covers that allow that prevent precipitation from leaching chemicals away from stored substances, or where they may have been, or if they were spilled, having a containment structure around those substances so it catches those substances. These are, again, all in the modeled language, and they're all similar to the requirements under State Rule 401. So beyond kind of these kind of practices, there's the sort of conceptual idea of how are we planning development in New Hampshire and across the community. The sort of planning, I guess the planning concept for some time about open space subdivisions has been to, design so that your lots are not quite as spread out, or they're not as spread out as, say, the picture to the upper left, where you have 1 to 2 acre lots, and you have, in some cases, very long lines and costs associated with water service in that type of development. You also have less open space and less natural cover, which leads to more stormwater and less natural landscape to mimic and really act as a filtering and cleaning ecosystem service for both surface water and groundwater. So there are a lot of benefits to water quality. This has been a sort of attribute of smart growth for some time, and it's also something that, if you haven't looked at that closely, it could be something to recommend that your development community look at first, or think more seriously about for future developments. Parking is probably one of those things that is a pretty easy and low-hanging fruit to think of. I think it can be the situation where you have underutilized parking. The designs may also be improved through better techniques, and the picture to the upper left is one, reducing the impervious area of the parking lot. It also can be used to drain water from the parking area into that space and be filtered through what you may know of as a bioretention stormwater practice, which is a series of plants and organic matter that will help to either bind or break down organics and catch metals and other things that come off of parking lots. So these designs can be much better than the standard, the bigger picture here, where you're seeing a lot of that water that's going to end up in a pipe and be drained, perhaps to a detention pond, but it could also just be drained off-site. So parking lot design to have additional vegetation, contouring, and ability to catch a lot of that stormwater is kind of the way, with the planning community I circle with, seems to be the way that many planners are thinking is a better approach to handling runoff, as well as, we have a lot of larger storms that have been coming in recent years. Those certainly, these types of designs to increase vegetation and to keep it on site more easily and infiltrate it on site is an important design concept that what you're looking at, I should say, are revised landscaping regulations that the city of Dover worked on through a grant from our program. So they have a document for designers and engineers to guide them in their design of parking regulations in Dover. Salt is a big issue in New Hampshire. In the last 40 years, a study that we commissioned in 2011 kind of captures and used the data we have on public water supply wells showing significant increases in sodium and chloride in public water supply wells. In a number of places, it's corrosive in terms of sodium chloride is essentially hard on equipment. It's also hard on water systems and treatment. It's difficult to treat. It's hard to remove, and we tend to overuse it. Many times, we're over salting in many cases. So there's a whole program set up in New Hampshire that many contractors have taken advantage of to reduce salt use, and many of these things like just even simple calibration, having staff being trained, tracking the salt that they throw down, using certain types of plows, brining and pre-wetting, which has now become much more prevalent in the I-93 corridor and in other places by DOT, as well as policies that towns have. All these things can add up to, along with getting people to think that maybe when there's 2 feet of snow out on the road, it may not be the best time to rush into your car and go someplace. So having that expectation that the roads need to be bare, at all times of the day in any storm is not really a realistic or greatest approach. And this is a project that really is trying to show a low development, sort of low impervious area. This was in Somersworth a number of years ago. This particular design in Terrascape was used to, what you're looking at is a site that has 719 parking stalls. Most of them are, except for the yellow areas, all of that area is porous. So water is not coming off that site. It's staying on site, and it's draining through your porous pavement or on-site stormwater. And that's a pretty big site. This is there's 125,000 square feet of just business space on this site. And so this is a particularly, where I got this from the city, the planner, and at that time thought this was a pretty great design, and certainly from a water quality and infiltration perspective was doing a pretty good job. So I think I've kind of made the point. I hope that our agency has been talking a lot about bioretention with respect to stormwater, and trying to advocate for that in development, in the development setting, whether that's a parking island or a median strip, or in the context of commercial design, so that the water that is generated, stormwater that's generated near a building or along roads, is staying close to those areas and not washing across large parking lots, capturing a lot of chemicals or substances and infiltrating that into, or discharging into streams or into the ground. So just a couple of basic concepts that we have advocated for in site plan review is to keep that certainly would make sense to contour drainage away from that. Also place any high-risk uses away from wells and use structural controls. So basically, some of the take-home points here are to plan developments to maximize clean recharge and minimize contaminants that are harmful to public health. Contamination limits growth. So the idea here is that protection is a better option than having to go through treatment and having to deal with remediation, which can be both expensive and have long-term liabilities, both environmental and financial. And work to think through which of these uses in your community are presenting a higher risk to your groundwater, to your drinking water resources. And work to define effective best practices, some of which we already have at the state level, but which can be applied to every development that involves particularly commercial activities that involve regulated substances. So I said I would mention something about private wells, and there are a significant number of private wells in Londonderry. So arsenic is probably one of the leading contaminants, which you've probably heard of in New Hampshire. It's typically a naturally occurring contaminant in bedrock wells. And currently, we believe there's about 1 out of every 4 wells, private wells in New Hampshire, that are above the 5, are estimated to be above the health standard of 5 parts per billion. So long-term impacts from that tend to be increases in bladder cancer, liver cancer, and some forms of cardiovascular disease. There's been a number of studies by Dartmouth and others in the region, and so it seems pretty certain that people drinking arsenic over a long period of time will likely correlate with some of these health impacts. And by and large, most residents in New Hampshire are not testing their water regularly. So avoiding these types of health impacts can be done at the state level through public water supplies, but we also have a number of communities that not a lot, but a few, that adopt private well ordinances, and I could provide you some examples, some of which are near Londonderry, that require both testing and or treatment of private wells. So generally, we tell people it's a good idea to test your water every 3 to 5 years, and we have about 15 contaminants we recommend people test, everything from bacteria to radon, and to treat your water when you find that these standards that your water has elevated levels of something in it. In Londonderry, in red, I highlighted a few contaminants this is data from the public health lab for samples that were taken from the town and that were processed in Concord at that lab. Arsenic is about, the third column, or the first red number, is the percent of wells exceeding health limit in Londonderry. It's about 25%. So that's a little bit below the number of percentage of wells that we know typically in Rockingham County. It's about 30%, but it's about the same as the overall average in our state of about 25. So you're basically at about where most of the state is in terms of the number of private wells that exceed arsenic levels of 5 parts per billion. In terms of other contaminants, radon, sodium, and uranium, a bit higher on uranium, a bit higher on sodium, and a bit higher on radon in terms of the state, and somewhat comparable to the county. So these are just some ideas, we would support. Our agency has supported both in terms of structural and operational controls on things like regulated substances. We have advocated for things like open space and low impact development alternatives for some time. And infiltration, stormwater, when you are sure that the practices are proven to eliminate or reduce and the expected pollutants. And sort of, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Stormwater Center, or perhaps there's also the National DNP performance data, which is useful for looking at what stormwater practices are likely to remove what type of contaminant. So our program has been around for a while. source water grants. We have a deadline coming up on November 1, and that money can be used in a variety of ways to protect drinking water at the local level. It's designed to do that. The grants are up to $25,000 now per project, and we have a manager. Her name is Bess Morrison. If you're interested in pursuing a local grant, we've done that for, as I said, 20 years. We also now have monies for land conservation. And so if many of you may be familiar with the Drinking Water and Groundwater Trust Fund, there was $2 million allocated for land conservation projects in New Hampshire. And there's additional money coming through the USDA's NRCS Regional Conservation Program, which is essentially an award from NRCS of about $6.5 million to conserve areas around drinking water supplies, typically. We oversee a number of other things that are listed here. We have some educational materials. Our bureau oversees all the new community well approvals, as well as large groundwater approvals and water conservation, which I didn't really touch on very much, but certainly this last year with the drought has been stressful for many water systems and a number of private well owners who I talk to on a regular basis weekly, whose wells have gone dry or are changed in terms of water quality due to the drought, typically. And also we approve all certain groundwater discharge permits, commercial discharge permits, and underground injection systems. So you can find us online and talk to any of our staff after today if there's any interest, and if you're pursuing an ordinance, we certainly can review the language as a function of our job. We just finished a project reviewing 106 town ordinances and are about to reach out to many of the regional planning commissions to work with them to improve those ordinances in a number of ways. So I think that's it for me on my presentation. I'm happy to, I think the chair has indicated that he would entertain questions at the end, so I'm happy to do that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Pierce.
Yeah, we'll take comments and questions. What I'm going to do is start if staff has any input for us, and then I'll go through the planning board and conservation commission. So, John?
I have nothing at this time.
Okay, Colleen?
Nope, nothing. I just encourage the board, if you have any questions, to ask Pierce, and we're glad to have him here to, be a source of information.
Yes, I'll start, Ann.
Nothing right now.
Okay, Jeff?
Yeah, just for curiosity, if Pierce, what have you seen towns that have implemented the ordinance? What has there been? Has there been any impact to sustaining the enforcement or any other costs that a town might want to consider as a result?
So I think the question is, are there costs associated with these results? Or
No, not
is
so
that
much.
the question?
Not so much the cost. And I apologize. I'm looking at implementing the ordinance, and then sustaining the ordinance. Like, who would be enforcing it? Is that just wrapped up into a current
Yeah.
So current.
For instance, for some of the standards associated with that are similar to ENV WQ401, like secondary containment, spill control, things of that nature. Once you approve the plan, then the site is built. I know of a number of code enforcement officers that are part of regular inspections that take place along with water systems. We train and have data. Essentially, we maintain a training database for about 200 water operators in our state that work for public water systems. Sometimes many of them municipal, that are involved every day in going out and inspecting sites to meet 401 requirements. So that would be consistent with probably a lot of what the planning board would be requiring under a new ordinance. So in Milford, for instance, they have a program that does exactly what basically determines compliance with 401, as do a number of other community systems, think about like a condo association or a small development that is essentially a community public water system that has maybe a volunteer board and a contract operator, public water staff. They really have very little resources to do things like on-site inspection, which was just one thing that has a lot of time and energy and resources into it to do it. But many of the larger community systems and larger towns that have staff have adopted either zoning or they can do groundwater reclassification. Some have chosen to do that, which has a number of similar protections and additional authorities that are given to the towns that do reclassify their aquifers or their wells or wellhead protection areas to protect those resources. So without giving you a specific answer, there's certainly a cost to some of these activities in terms of compliance with code or enforcement on a regular basis. And DES does share that because we administer the rule that many of these performance standards are essentially the same, it would not be out of the question, and certainly I get calls about compliance where our staff would look at that particular site and decide if it was violating the rule and could enforce the rule at that point. So the state could share in some of those costs with respect to compliance.
And just a follow-up question to that, the grant programs that you presented at the end of the presentation, could towns potentially leverage those funds to subside costs of implementing this ordinance?
It's a good question. We tend not to fund operating budgets. The commitment by a town to say one of the last towns we worked with was Plastow, and code enforcement took the lead on both inventorying sites that they felt they needed that were essentially in this. I've said this term very very much, but potential contamination sources, which many of those are defined under state statute and the Groundwater Protection Act in sort of a list form. But basically, it's anything that in a commercial setting can affect the quality or safety of groundwater or drinking water. And so Plastow basically has a program that they've stood up. We funded that town's plan, which included a section on how they were going to adopt the specific activities, including the inspection activities. So the grant can pay for planning, but I don't think, and it would be a harder thing to pay for something certainly more than a year. The grants go for 1 year, and would not likely be something we would look at as an operator. The funding would probably not be eligible for for salaries and wages to pay for someone to do that, because it certainly wouldn't be something that would be sustainable. So you'd be doing it for a year and then it would end. So if the town has, a discussion might be worthy of if there's interest in this as to the time and energy it would take and what kind of staff resources might in town may be able to do this. And I should say that most of these programs do this type of inspection over a period of months to years. So it's not something that our programs for both community water systems and municipalities tend to have a extended period of time where these inspections get done over 1 to 3 years. So they're not done in 6 weeks. So you have to invest a significant amount of time. The inspections, having done them, can last an hour to 2 hours typically. And usually this is not a highly complicated inspection. So I can certainly give you more detail if you're interested in that particular activity. The planning piece of this and the design piece is obviously less intensive in terms of public dollars going to into design and requirements related to the other elements of the zoning ordinance.
Pierce, thank you. I'm all set, Mr. Chair.
Jeff, Lynn?
Hi, good evening, Pierce. So this has been one of the rainiest seasons we've had, rainiest summers we've had in a lot of years. So I'm hoping it takes some of the pressure off some of the private wells where people were experiencing shortages of water. But does the rainy weather affect the quality of the water, or do you expect it to affect the quality of the water at all? Will it cleanse the water of some of the contaminants, or will it add anything because there's just that much more water going into the ground?
Yeah, I apologize. Some of your question did not come through clearly to me, but I think what you're asking me is, we've had a drought, now we've had a heavy amount of rain, and can that affect the quality of what private well water, whether it's additional contaminants or changes in the hydrogeology, where water is coming from and making its way into wells? And I think the answer to those questions is generally yes. I'm not a hydrogeologist, but I answer a lot of questions about private well concerns and problems from the public every week. And when things were drier, it seemed to me that many people had not just dry wells, but changes in their water quality, and likely that was due to different patterns of groundwater, where the groundwater was coming from predominantly into their well. So if you think about the cracks and fissures in bedrock and being at one level and then diminishing or going down and going through the amount of water coming from certain portions of a bedrock aquifer, for instance, might change when the water level changes. And so it seemed to me that the answer to that question is certainly some people are experiencing changes to water when water goes down to a drought, and then also when it goes back up. So the same type of sort of logic is that, and I think many, this is all just sort of subjective, but a number of dug wells seem to be, more impacted when we have these heavy rains, because they're taking in a lot of surface water with a very thin veneer of ground, of soil and stone or whatever above those concrete boxes. So they may have much more direct discharge from a road or from a wetland or from a nearby ditch that's receiving something that it wasn't receiving when you get 8 inches of water, or your groundwater levels come up quite a bit. So we did have quite a bit of water over the last month or so, and that certainly has improved the conditions for many public water systems generally in terms of their volume, that they can, they have to worry so much about how deep their wells are draining down, or their reservoirs are filled up again. But for private well owners, it does seem like more dramatic changes in the drought to sort of flood type of weather seems to be affecting. Some of these wells are ancient. They might be 50 to 100 years old, so they often are they're not designed in accordance with standards. So today's standards, there's also a design element, I think, to some of these issues that are going on.
Okay, thank you. That was my question. My second question is, we're bordered by 3 states, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Maine, and by, the Canadian province of Quebec. How consistent are what the New Hampshire DES practices are with what the other states, our neighboring states, or, in the New England region? How consistent are we across the region with what else is being done?
So I heard about different states, but I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the gist of the question.
And just so folks realize, the microphone that's picking up, even though it's counterintuitive because Pierce is on the screen behind you, but the microphone picking up is here. Pierce, the question was, how consistent are New Hampshire's regulations with those of the states surrounding us and the province of Quebec? Are we in line with surrounding states, or are there different standards? How vastly different are they?
Well, that's a good question. Every state kind of has its own take on how to protect. I'm gonna take that question with respect to drinking water. So, in Massachusetts, for instance, the state has many regulations, and in particular things like for large reservoirs, they have very strict buffering requirements around reservoirs, and different. It's a hard question to answer. I guess I would answer it that many states have their own approach, but generally speaking, source protection has a fairly standard kind of toolkit for how we protect the quality of drinking water. In terms of development and how you approach development and protect water supplies, again, it's difficult to say where New Hampshire stands. I think we have a much more locally active protection effort than many states in the region. I can't think of many of our adjoining states that have as much local activity, and I think that's in part due to the way that New Hampshire runs its government, as well as the way that we control development. I mean, planning boards control a large percentage, 80% of all development public flows through the planning boards. And so that may be different in other states, but I think New Hampshire is kind of a leader. I might be biased on drinking water protection. We've spent a lot of time trying to work together with our state, and I'm not saying DES necessarily is the leader. I'm saying as a state, our legislature, local communities, our state agencies have, I think, done a really good job to try to protect drinking water, at the same time as balancing economic and cultural priorities. And so, and I think we've responded really well in many cases to the challenges to dealing with new contaminants, emerging contaminants, and it's difficult to control. So, not sure I'm totally answering your question, but I think in general, from a regulatory perspective, I think we take the right balance for this state, for New Hampshire. Other states, I think, have more, like Massachusetts, have more control at the state level than we do in New Hampshire, but we make up for that with a lot more activity at the local level.
Okay, thank you.
Also,
You're
Lynn?
welcome.
Yep. Deb?
Thank you. I guess first and foremost, Pierce, thank you for spending your evening with us and
You're welcome.
enlightening us with all this information and ideas. I think it's really beneficial. I want to know, how do we as a town get started? And because you came up with all these models for groundwater ordinances, and some of them were some really great ideas. But I guess, where do we begin? And, what's the first steps that we as a community have to take to start implementing, if the town wishes to do this? So I guess I want to know where the starting point is, and basically how long it takes to get it going. So I guess I'll go with that question first.
That's a good question. Okay, so I'll just use, based on my experience with, I was a town planner for a while, and I would say a standing committee in town that could be under the planning board or conservation commission, whose purpose was well defined, to protect, to work on the protection, to work to protect drinking water resources in town, and that had some clear objectives on what they wanted to do, and to articulate that as in some type of a planning document. Some communities do write up source water protection plans. I mentioned Glasgow, and that plan became kind of their roadmap for what they wanted to do. Plans aren't perfect, but I think a well thought out plan is a good place to start. It could take a year, and our program actually would fund a third party to help you write the plan. If your staff in town didn't have time or wanted someone with some experience and background, some organizations in New Hampshire have staff. Brand State Rural Water Association is one that provides assistance for communities to develop source water protection plans. So my general answer is, a plan is a good place to start. A committee is a good place to start, of interested people who can brainstorm and think this through for your community. And the other place to start in feel as if there's been some communication of what drinking water source protection is all about, and why some of the things that may be suggested in the future are being suggested, and that really depends upon informing people on a regular basis, sort of continuously. So it's good. It's well invested time to have people become more aware and of the resources that are in the ground or providing drinking water from private wells. And so how long, that really depends. I mean, I think Plasto probably took between 1 year to maybe 1 to 2 years to really get started, both the plan, and they had a committee, they had a source water protection committee that formed. That was, I don't recall who they reported to, whether it was part of the select board or the planning board, but those are all good first steps. And having a good public, like I said, public communication with this is important. It's really important. So that's what I've seen work in other places. It all kind of depends on the community as well. So I think 1 to 2 years is reasonable to really get something done.
So would your organization help us by advising us and maybe holding our hand a little bit and giving us a direction as to, okay, you need to do this, you need to do that, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel, and just basically get up and running a little bit quicker. I'm hoping that that's something your organization would be willing to help a community if that is the path it wishes to go down.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, we help in as much as we can from the technical assistance perspective. We do have a lot of communities in New Hampshire, so our time with each one can't be each week, but we do have organizations, and there's a lot of guidance directed towards municipalities, both from us and from EPA and from others, on how to implement source water protection, drinking water protections for communities. So many of these sort of tools are out there, but I think I hear what you're saying, and certainly having a someone that does this on a regular basis to help is certainly available from us. I'll just say on a limited basis, because that's just the way it is.
Right.
There's one of me and a couple others, and that's it.
Okay,
And,
so I guess we have to get on a waiting list then. But again, I just want to say thank you, and as far as being one person on this board, I would love to see us move forward with something relatively quickly, and hopefully you'll be finishing up with some other town and be able to squeeze us in. That would be amazing.
So I'm happy to come to Londonderry, and I think for a sustained effort, I mean, there are organizations that, Emily Voldemore, who works for Granite State Rural Water Association, her job is to develop source water protection plans for communities. So she's on task through her funding to do that.
What was her name again?
I could certainly mention Londonderry if there's interest, and she could come talk to you about a year-long effort, and that's what they would do. They would help in the drafting, and if you go on their website, you'll see these services are advertised, and plans. I think if they haven't posted their plans, I have a number of them, and you can get a sense of what a plan looks like.
Again, thank you for sharing your night with us and all of this great information. Thank you.
Certainly good information. I noticed the model ordinance is actually quite good and thorough. There's a whole section on that on education. So it's probably a good starting point for us to get going. Most of it's right before us. It's just getting it put together. Now,
Yeah, Pierce, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I read in the documentation that you don't recommend drawing hard boundaries around aquifers. So how would a community know whether a particular one was shrinking or expanding?
So aquifers, the way that USGS delineates those lines, the way they draw those lines is they look at the material. So they look at the ground, they do borings, and they look at basically they look at the pore space, the porosity, and it's called hydrologic conductivity. They look at these things that allow water to reside and stay and be available in the ground to be essentially drawn out. So think of it like a large tub, and in the tub is a lot of sand and gravel and other material that has the capacity to hold a lot of water. And so the definition isn't necessarily about the water level, where, you know, if the tub is mostly empty, it changes the footprint of the aquifer. The aquifer is the geologic remnant of, you know, basically the glaciers retreating and leaving a lot of material that allows the holding of large amounts of water. So those boundaries don't change, generally speaking.
Okay, thanks for that explanation. Have you heard of or had any experience with aquifers that went dry, decreased in size, anything like that?
Well, out west. Yeah. Not aquifers. I mean, our hydrology and conservation group is much more tuned into the well, when wells, public water supply wells are having problems with drawdown. So they're monitoring how deep the water level is for public water supply. So in drought, you know, we get calls, or we try to help community water systems deal with when their water levels are dropping in the section of the aquifer that the well is drawing water from. But overall, I mean, there's only a sort of very limited number of sort of what I would guess term research type of wells that USGS maintains that looks at water levels in aquifers from a more research or applied research perspective. So there's not a lot of data just involving aquifers in terms of their water levels. And you can look online, you can see some of the reports from USGS in New Hampshire that look at water level changes, but by and large, that's a pretty small sample of research, and so I couldn't tell you if water levels in where they were in Londonderry, in one part of Londonderry or another. I'm not sure anybody else can.
Okay, thank you. That's a great explanation. I'm all set.
Yanni?
Pierce, I had a question when you were going through your presentation about my question is, what is defined as a snow dump?
Yeah, that's a good question. Basically anything, if you're taking snow from other parts of town or other portions of town, anywhere else than the snow is generated, you're picking it up. You know, in the town I used to live in, they would put dump trucks, fill them with snow from take a parking lot. You pick it up, you move it from that parking lot, and then you create a much bigger, essentially, dump of snow, and leave it to melt, essentially, in a certain spot. So that snow is going to be filled with sediment, salt, perhaps oils, other things that are scraped off the surface of the parking area. And so if you're putting that all in one large area, and usually what DPWs will do is they'll put them down by a river or a flat spot, and it will infiltrate, or it will run off. And it's either going to go in the ground or go into a river. And we have some practices that try to minimize for those places where it's necessary to pick snow up and move it to a particular spot, because you can't leave it. But basically a snow dump is a collection of snow from parking lots or roads where it couldn't stay on that particular area, and it has to go to a particular collection area. So that, in my mind, is what a snow dump is.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted, I figured that, but I just wanted to ask that question. Now I see you, the first part of your presentation, you were talking about a lot of the fuel-based additives that have a high likelihood of contaminating water, but where do like all the nitrates and fertilization, you know, the chemlons and all that, where does that all play into this?
Well, New Hampshire, so when I think of nutrients, that is a piece of it. There are everything from row crops that receive fertilizers that are either nitrogen or phosphorus based. There's New Hampshire is about 3 or 4% agriculture, so it's not a huge use in New Hampshire. There is the commercial application of fertilizers. Some people doing it on their own or coming through ChemServe or commercial services. There's wastewater treatment facilities that discharge phosphorus. So these things come from a variety of sources in terms of, and where do they go? Well, they go, they either go into our groundwater or they go into surface water, and they can break down, and it's you know, as in the coast where there's a heavy emphasis on nitrogen because of the concern for Great Bay. There's a large, and I don't know the percentage, a large component of nitrogen and phosphorus that come through both wastewater discharges from wastewater treatment plants, which is why the state was engaged with a number of communities years ago on trying to both carrot and stick with respect to, you know, the wastewater treatment plants and their discharges and getting those upgraded, as well as on-site stormwater. So the stormwater component is also another source of contamination in Great Bay. So nitrogen, phosphorus can all wash off. And I can't really give you a lot of statistics on, you know, what kind of land use is associated more or less with nitrogen and phosphorus, but, you know, agriculture, farming animals, you know, whether it's in some cases in the coast or in Rockingham County, there seems to be a lot more horses or equestrian, you know, so it can come from a variety of uses that involve animals, people, and fertilizers generally.
All right, my last question is regarding the parking lots. In the example you provided where you broke it up and had more trees, et cetera, versus the big flat parking lots. Where is the trade-off in your mind between, you know, putting all that out, landscaping within the parking areas then needs to be irrigated to survive, or what's the solution behind that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's a whole field of study called xeriscaping, which has been designed mostly in the Southwest, which uses very low amounts of irrigation water, because that's exactly true. You don't want to have to be out in the middle of the parking lot in the summer with heavy usage of water to just keep the plants alive. So low, drought tolerant and water limited landscaping is a field of its own. And while I'm not an expert in that area, it's something that I don't think a landscape architect would have too hard a time giving you a good answer to that question in terms of which specific species and plants will both will form will function in that setting. I don't see as much of the sort of some of the picture I mentioned to you. There is some amount of that kind of parking lot sort of tree scaping and islandscaping inside of the parking lot. So probably more common would be sort of a sheet runoff area where you have grasses and sort of low maintenance vegetation that would simply be taking that water off more than just, you know, a lot of it would be sort of intercepted by these kind of natural bioretention areas. And so again, for bioretention, you're really talking about essentially a detention pond that has organic material at the bottom, topped off with sand, topped off with sand, organics, and then vegetation. And so that vegetation actually receives a lot of water when it comes down. Much of that is, so you're not really needing to water it, it's getting the runoff from a large area and tends to be again planted with in a manner by that it isn't really depending on maintenance. We did a couple of those up in Laconia, and I haven't heard. I think they work pretty well. And you can talk. I can get you in touch with Department of Public Works, who we work with, to take a fairly large area and discharge it into a bioretention, stormwater practice versus piping it into Caugus Bay, which is where they get their water from. So it's a good question, because I'm not really the best person to answer it, but I think it's certainly doable to get something into these parking areas that intercepts and collect and infiltrate stormwater without a lot of maintenance. And certainly maintenance not just for water, but trees have branches, trees have leaves, and so there is a cost and expense to this. But again, if your objective is to balance the water quality and control water quality, dealing with larger storms, that's another question. You're paying a cost to re-engineer some of your harder infrastructure these days. We keep breaking records, so the more you can design green infrastructure that is not going to be washed out, overwhelmed, or actually play a role in minimizing that from happening in the first place, seems to be a good strategy in my mind.
Yeah, well, I do too, because I think there's a balance between, you want to break it up, and I understand the filtration component of the water flowing into these areas, but you also want to make sure you're not putting as much, you're not having to load it up with water and use it to support plants that aren't going to survive there, and also the plow damage that comes on an annual basis. So, but those are my questions. Thank you.
Good question.
What's that, Jerry? Bruce?
No questions.
Roger?
Yes, one of the things we've been talking about here is surface water, water runoff, groundwater. Is those just verbiage defining the same thing, or is there some technical differences?
So is there a technical difference between groundwater and surface water?
Yes.
Is that the question?
Yes, that's the question, yes.
Yes.
Well, there's a lot of legal differences between the two. The way we manage and control and use and protect both surface water differs greatly from groundwater. Surface water has a bigger focus on stormwater these days. So there's a lot of rules and requirements at the state level and federal level. I don't know if you're an MS4, but I'm guessing you are.
We are.
You're part of a federal permit, so that deals with communities that have to implement various practices to minimize stormwater impacts upon that are controlled. Those rules go through EPA. So stormwater has been a real focus because it's been identified as essentially the leading cause for degradation of water quality in surface water. So it's regulated much differently, but it has similar. We really kind of want the same thing. We want water quality in our surface waters to be high quality, and not just for drinking water. New Hampshire is a recreational state. We have a lot of mixed uses and recreational uses in surface water bodies, and so it's really a hard thing to see lakes and that we use for swimming bloom in the summer. So we want to the state and by really definition people, New Hampshire want their lakes and rivers to be not filled with invasive species and nutrients that are causing plant growth, that are causing blooms. So how we would address that is the ways we address that for surface water are tend to be regulatory and or educational for homeowners in many cases. So the statutes and the way that the laws does break out, really have to take a different approach. But in the end, it's sort of the same goal. We're trying to reduce our impact on the quality of water through the ways that we think are that are where these contaminants are coming from. So again, for surface water, you're talking about runoff. For groundwater, you could be talking about a facility that just isn't doing what it needs to do on an everyday basis. And so, meaning they may be spilling trichloroethylene out back, or discharging into their septic system, or doing something that is really not conducive to long-term groundwater quality that we can then use as a drinking water source. So there are different approaches, but I think in the end, the whole purpose of our agency is really to work with and the legislature is to define the lines where we reasonably can protect our water supplies and our natural resources for a whole variety of reasons beyond public health. I can say many people are pretty interested when in many places with the quality of their lake, because they want to swim in that lake. But a number of those lakes also serve as water supplies. They may not even know that, but they really want their water in their lake to look, the way it always looks, and not bloom, which is happening more frequently these days.
Thank you.
Jake?
Yeah, a question kind of back to the snow dump thing. What do you see as a good alternative to creating a snow dump?
Smaller parking lots. I won't debate people on the side of the regulations, because I'm not familiar enough with them anymore, but it seems to me we have pretty large parking lots in some places that don't need to be so big. And in some cases, those lots can sustain more porous material. Porous pavement's a bit of a stretch for a number of places, and many of your DPWs probably won't want to see a lot of porous material because because it can plug. It can, especially if you're sanding it. But smaller parking lots is one way to reduce the amount of snow dumps. I don't really know. I mean, I think in many downtowns, where I used to live, it was pretty necessary. Like I used to live in Milford, and there's an oval in the center of town. So if you've been there, you know that the parking around that oval gets, if you have a foot or two of snow, it all needs to get pushed out and put somewhere. And so they put it down by the Sahegan River, and they put it back from the river a bit, and they let it melt out. I don't know exactly what the answer is. If you're talking about salt, we do have, many places are starting to use brine. The state uses a lot of brine, so that reduces sodium chloride in the snow mix, the snowpack that's going to be moved. In terms of oils and greases and things of that nature, metals, those are harder to deal with. But I guess if I'm taking the long view, a lot of oils tend to break down over time in soil. It's not a great thing, but it does happen. So I don't really have a great solution for you, except that try to keep those dumps away from. We do have our Watershed Bureau has a snow dump fact sheet with some guidance on how to minimize the impacts of snow dumps, and I can pass that along to you. I think they have a setback from surface water of either 25 or 50 feet, and they have a few other practices that are sort of designed to minimize the impacts of surface water. I certainly wouldn't. That's why we're limiting them in this ordinance. I don't know how you really can always put a snow dump in an area next to a well. I think that would be a bad idea. I think eventually the amount of salt or metals or other things that are coming off of that lot or large commercial area will eventually make its way into a well. So that's why we don't want to see those in areas where you're drinking that water.
And one more for you on one of the slides was something about the New Hampshire Green Snow Program. Do you have an idea how many municipalities have adopted what's inside of that green snow program, as well as municipalities and private companies?
No, I don't, but I know it's not small. It's a few hundred operators, and so the SnowPro program, it's housed at the Technology Transfer Program at UNH in Durham. So they teach out of that center, and I know they have hundreds of people, operators of snowplows, both public and private, who are out and who are taking classes to essentially learn more about brining and low salt practices, and application rates and calibration training. So they get certified to be a snow pro operator, and in theory they're practicing that when they go out. Towns tend to send their staff there, so DPWs can take advantage of that as well, learn about new technologies like onboard sensors and things of that nature that help operators to minimize the use of salt. So numbers they're not small. I mean, I think it's fairly common, and there's both a marketing advantage to this for private companies who can bill themselves as Snow Pro certified, and there's also liability protection that was changed in state statutes. So one of the concerns that was addressed in state law within the last few years was, if you're applying a lower amount of salt in your application rates, or you're doing something that essentially could be leading to someone slipping and falling, the new law provides limited liability coverage to those certified applicators, salt applicators, road maintenance folks, to lawsuits related to that. So the Watershed Bureau at DES led that effort with the legislature, and so I'd say if you do have interest in this, we both have salt data. We have a lot of small community systems in Londonderry. I can certainly look at trying to get you some salt information about how your public water systems are doing. And I think in the slide I gave you, I think there was some sodium numbers that looked the percentages looked rather high. It's not a bad thing to look at over time. I think we use a lot of salt in the state, so you guys also have a major highway. So there's always opportunities to do that. Sodium chloride is an issue for public water systems, but it's also for folks who are on private wells who have hypertension. They can be, you have to have a lot of sodium in your water to affect you, but the EPA uses, I think, 60 milligrams per liter as a benchmark for people who are on salt-restricted diets. And in the United States, that's, people with hypertension, it's, I don't know, 1 in 4, 1 in 5 maybe. So there are
Good percentage.
high sodium in your water is not a good thing, and it also really kills your water treatment system or your water heaters. It's very corrosive, so it also has an impact on your appliances in your home.
John, we have a program for Woodmont Commons, training program, because I know it's been part of the master plan, Woodmont Commons master plan.
The town participates in the Green program.
Yes.
All of our drivers have gone.
Involves the I-93 corridor, so there's participation here from operators that.
Correct, and quite a few of the landscapers have gone through that training too, Jake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have. And for Colleen, real quick, if the town were to elect to put a committee together, do you think that's something that we would have the bandwidth to be able to help plan in-house, or you'd want to take advantage of what would be available for grant money to help with the planning process?
We would need to take a look at the committee charge to determine what can be absorbed with current staffing and what would need to be outsourced.
Okay, thank you.
Was that Jake?
Yep.
Jason? I have no questions. Okay, Ann had her hand up.
I looked over the model groundwater protection ordinance, and it's very thorough. I just have a question. because I'm looking back into, is it Appendix I? And I'm looking at who has, what towns have aquifer protection districts around us. Derry does since 1995, Litchfield since 2005, Merrimack since 2004, Wyndham since 2009. And there's been a lot of testing going on. But some of the chemicals that we're finding now have been in use since the 1980s, especially in Litchfield, because I lived in Litchfield at that point in time, till the early 1990s. How could contaminants like PFAS fly into the radar for so long? Is it because the testing standards finally caught up with the chemicals? And what was it the model that you have now in use in 2015 that might have stirred more of a recognition of what was out there? It's very thorough, your ordinance, and I was just wondering, what determined that? Was it the reduction in the percent, the increase in the PFOAs, or was it the reduction in the standards that they
So
tested for?
what was really precipitating the model? Why we have it? Is that the question?
No.
Why do we have this model? The reason, I think, before my time, in the 90s, in New Hampshire at least, in many places, petroleum, underground storage tanks, above ground storage tanks, but mostly I think underground storage tanks, and chemical usage that was kind of being, you think of your standard junkyard 30 years ago. Many people just didn't have an awareness over the chemicals they used and what the potential impact to both them and their neighbors or their community could be. And so as one after another high-profile event took place, where community's water supply was contaminated by petroleum products or a chemical product, the political will to begin to protect these resources for community development and for public health became, manifested itself both at the state and federal level. So, a number of laws in New Hampshire, and the big one in New Hampshire is the New Hampshire Groundwater Protection Act, which authorizes, DES and local communities to adopt these tools to protect their water resources and drinking water resources. And so I think this predates the PFOA, the perfluorinated compounds, and frankly doesn't really address them in a great way at this point. But you could certainly, as a part of your exercise in looking at the risks, think about some of these emerging, what we call emerging contaminants, but contaminants that have become part of our lexicon for groundwater now. We have 4 standards for 4 different perfluorinated compounds, and 1,4-dioxane is certainly an issue too. But it's So to answer your question, I think this ordinance has been in play for nearly 20 years, and some version we've been updating it every 3 or 4 years. It's actually overdue, but that really came out of the petroleum and chemical kind of impacts to communities, and not so much recently to the emerging contaminants that are now making news.
And also, we have much more sensitive testing methods than there were even 3-4 years ago, because like all the EPA tests, it's all with high-performance liquid chromatography and mass spectrometry that they can detect these things. And it's also, these methods are good for detecting unknowns. And once you find something unknown, and then you identify the molecule, and it could be something that's been here for 50 years, but we have not had the detection methods to find it.
Right, because,
the detection methods have definitely gotten better over the last.
And it's become much more sensitive. We can
Yeah,
measure down to the picogram levels and even femtogram levels. So
I guess it had to be to detect the PFOAs, because when I lived in Litchfield, all we tested was for iron or manganese. Could you smell it and see it? And I lived in the northern section of Litchfield, right across from the St. Gobain plant. So,
the stuff you can't see or anything. It's just like a lot of the proteins in your body. You can't see or feel them or anything, but yet they're highly effective at what they do.
well, thank goodness that we're working on it, and I hope hopefully in 2021, we get to see our groundwater protection ordinance going through.
Life is a constant learning process, so. And I'm going to Conservation Commission, March. You can come to the front here to the microphone, and Deb and Mike. Any questions, or?
Someone already asked my question.
Oh, okay. Yeah, why don't you come to the microphone, Deb, so people can, everyone can hear you, please.
This is not directly to Pierce, but to Art and Colleen. What could Southern New Hampshire Planning get us started on some of this immediate organization on something like this?
think
And
we
I don't
can,
know whether, I haven't heard anything there about them doing groundwater studies, but.
No, but I
but-
think we can inquire and.
Because we
and,
pay dues
talk with
and they'll do
Sylvia.
certain things for us for
Yeah.
less than market, so.
See what, they can do if they have anyone on staff that has any expertise in this area, because this is gonna require a degree of expertise.
And time.
Yes, definitely time. So, Mike?
Pierce, can you hear me okay from this mic?
I can.
Do you know of towns that have taken a more stringent approach to requiring infiltration that, goes beyond the state's requirements right now? And if so, how far have they gone and how successful have they been and how much pushback have they experienced?
Yeah, so your question is how do I know of other communities that have gone further in terms of requiring on-site infiltration of stormwater? I don't. I mean, I'm sure I have read them in terms of, percentages of sometimes I've just seen language that just says all runoff generated on-site shall be infiltrated on the site and not discharged off-site. I mean, there was some general language I've seen in some places. So I'm sure, and again, our model is really saying you need a plan once you reach 15% or 2,500 square feet of impervious area. You need to have a plan that's designed to deal with that runoff. And I have some sense of the different summaries. Like there's on the coast, there's 45 communities that their planning laws or zoning ordinances and rules and site plan or subdivision are categorized and reported by UNH's PREP program, and the Bay, basically the Static Cloud Bay effort has done a lot of work to identify and sort of use as a tool a breakdown of all these requirements, including impervious cover and I think stormwater. I'm not sure about stormwater requirements in terms of on-site infiltration, but a lot. If you look back at probably the Innovative Land Use Guide, which is a document that's outdated now, but there's probably some amount of guidance on and language around on-site infiltration, because that's a big piece of minimizing impacts to streams and rivers off-site. So no, I can't really name communities that have really stringent stormwater controls in that area, but my guess is the 45 communities that are under the MS4 program are probably doing a lot of, I know they have to have ordinances. And I don't know, is Londonderry an MS4 community or have
Yes.
jurisdictional areas? under
Yes,
that
we are,
plan?
Pierce. Yep, we are.
Yeah, so do you have an ordinance that talks about stormwater?
We do.
And, yeah, so
Yep.
do those require on-site infiltration or no?
Not yet, Pierce, it's still a couple of years away for LID development in the town.
Yeah, so that's sort of, yeah, I mean, I think that's the way to go. And I know that there's a couple models that the RPCs or EPA have put out for stormwater language for stormwater controls. I think Rockingham Planning Commission and UNH came up with one at some point a few years ago. So I'm not gonna answer the question. Sorry, I don't know the specific town I would point you to look at from a really good, strong stormwater ordinance. But you know, there are others who probably in the planning realm can find those towns pretty quickly.
And it's always a very much of a balancing act, where again, DES requires infiltration, but again, so if the infiltration doesn't work, you have excess surface water. So what do you want? You want to get, infiltrate or not infiltrate, and then, flood somebody out down gradient, so. And again,
you guys have probably seen projects where that exact scenario can play out. I haven't been looking at site plans and subdivision plans or in great measure, but it can be very difficult in some cases where you don't have the capacity to take the water that you're generating and deal with it on site. That's an engineering question. There are many ways to do that. I would assume if someone really, but in some cases that's the hard job of the planning board is where that doesn't work. What's where there's no solution to it from an engineering perspective. That's a hard place to be for a landowner or a project.
and the operation and maintenance portion of it too, Pierce.
Yeah.
Again, they're making widgets. They're not looking at what's happening with their, the vegetative wetlands.
Yeah, no, that's true, and right. I know it's your part of your job is once you walk away from the plan approval, you leave it to the property owners to, I assume, to maintain these stormwater infrastructure, including cleaning out culverts, dredging. I assume at some point stormwater practices when they fill in the sediment over time, and I know that goes beyond what the planning board would normally be looking at doing on a month-to-month, day-to-day basis. Sorry, don't have a good answer for you yet.
Thanks very much, Pierce, for the generous amount of time you've given us tonight. So rather than ask any other questions, I'm going to put that in the bank for that amount of limited support that you talked to us about earlier.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk with your board members, Colleen, whoever. If after tonight we could certainly set up an additional meeting or two. I could introduce you to some of the people that who offer extended services, like I mentioned. The Granite State Rural Water Association is one. So there are others that can, not a lot of others, but I mean, there's a little bit more sustained resources. Plus, you could, as I mentioned, the grant could put a third party into your community and help to shepherd either a plan or an ordinance, whichever. Like Colleen said, once you do that assessment, you determine what you need. You can contact me or Bess Morrison. She would be more than happy to sit down with you and talk about what's eligible under our grant program and how to craft an application. Londonderry has a number of community sources, so our interest in our program tends to be around protecting active community water sources, but that can also include the aquifers that contribute water to those, as long as they're those community water systems are essentially tied to the aquifer in the aquifers that you're protecting. There's, that's kind of some of the eligibility criteria that we use for our grants, and that Bess would do a pretty good job, a very good job to explain how to put the grants together. They're not particularly, onerous in terms of the time to do it. It's probably less than 5 pages. So, and last year we left money on the table because I think in part everybody was struggling to keep the lights on, and with COVID. So this year we've been heavily promoting the grant program and trying to get communities and water systems to take advantage of the funds that are available, which every year is usually around $250,000. So we're looking at about 10 to 15 fundable projects, and last year every one of them got funded. So, and usually more than half get funded of the applications. So there's a good chance if you develop an application that, and we can see that it's consistent with our program criteria. The money is federally funded, so we follow additional sort of rules from EPA, but it's not a big deal to put an application together.
Great,
Good to
thanks,
know.
Pierce.
Yeah, it's good to know.
Great.
But certainly we can utilize Pierce again, or he can help us with other levels of expertise that exist within the DES. One more person, a citizen of town who is very interested in water, Ray Breslin.
Hi, Ray. Is Ray there? I can see him.
Ray is here.
Everyone
He's-
knows
I didn't
Ray.
know if I was gonna be allowed or not. Ray Breslin. Pierce, I want to thank you for coming and providing so much important information. I know we've talked in the past. Matter of fact, you came here a number of years ago. And so, some good points. A town committee definitely should be formed. Why not? I mean, absolutely. And Jeff, I think you were concerned with cost and so forth, which is important too. We could actually ask for some volunteers too. They don't cost nothing. You know what I mean? Now, the town is going to run the show. That's fine. But, and another thing was brought up is education. I think we need to present this to the schools in Londonderry. We need to have the children involved in their own health and welfare, the protection of water. I think it's something to think about.
So you'll volunteer, Ray?
Hell yeah. Yeah, we definitely need a committee.
Yeah, I'll get
Okay.
Bruce?
Would the planning board have the purview to have a subcommittee such as water protection on it?
Yes.
Or would that have to be under the purview of the town council?
Planning board is really, well, certainly I can talk with the chair of the town council, see how he feels about it, and we'll go from there. But I think a group, and I think the group would have to have a certain level of expertise in this area to provide, but it would either be under the planning board or the town council.
I think we have the Conservation Commission that probably may want to be involved too.
Oh, certainly. That goes, as far as I'm concerned, without question. But like Colleen, myself, and Marge, we can work together, and I'm sure the chair of the town council
We'll look at coordinating
will
with
weigh in.
the town manager's office and the other, there are some other task forces and some groups that have, direct charges. We'll take a look to make sure that we're not overlapping and find out what's the best organization that would make sense for
That would
committee.
be the way I'd like to see the
Yes.
go. is if
I think
we-
we're still waiting for the report from the task force.
Yes.
PFAS, which would be a separate entity, but we just want to make sure we're not duplicating any efforts.
Right. Yeah.
I think that water's important, but I'm certainly not as passionate as Ray is about it.
Ray is very
so
passionate, so.
I think it's
Yeah,
very important.
I'm old. It's not about me. It's about the children,
And
That's what
I
it's
have,
about.
I have 4 young kids in town, so I want to make sure that, we
There you
leave
go.
we leave
And-
a town that's
And
got good
they
water.
may have their own opinion,
I'd like to hear it.
I have an 8-year-old that's got an opinion on everything.
There you go. It's about us as responsible adults doing the right thing,
I agree,
okay?
Yep, we gotta teach the kids. Okay, Ray.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
And, yes, so thank you very much, Pierce. We
Thank you, Pierce, we
appreciate it.
appreciate it.
You've helped us
Thank you,
greatly.
everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
All right, thanks.
Have a
All right.
great rest
Thank
of your
you.
meeting.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Mr. Chair, just one quick comment. I also kind of, I like the idea of integrating some type of water education within the school systems, within our purview, of course, just because I think I have an 8-year-old as well that, surprisingly knows a lot more than I thought she would. But I think that's a good opportunity, especially having, introducing that type of area at a young age and how it impacts the community they live in. So I would also support that
Yes.
aspect.
Highly effective. I remember back in 1987 when we created the Solid Waste Committee and started recycling. Members of the committee went into the schools to educate the kids. And the kids were probably the ones who educated the parents on how to recycle and everything. And that was the main part of
that's a good
the
model.
whole program. That's how we get the recycling started, so.
So would this committee be, Mr. Chair, like when you had the implementation committee, that was like a part of, but subcommittee of the planning board? And then they had to present to the planning board and then would present to the council? Like it wouldn't be like a task force where it would be on a task and dissolve, because I think it's something that would constantly be.
Well, we have to be careful of constant committees, because I know an individual who complains about the town has all sorts of committees, and now they're going through to at least create some sense of reasonability in what they all are doing, because they all want money for their budgets, so.
I
We'll
would think
take
it would be a
we'll take a look at
non-budgetary-
what Pierce mentioned, Plastow. We'll take a look at other communities and see what format their committees, how they've been charged, if it's been something that is a council or selectman formed organization in other communities, or a planning board task force. So we'll come back with some
Because task
ideas.
force to me feels like they're on one task and they're done. They have a mission, get it done, and move on. Committee sounds to me that's something that is a kind of an ongoing thing, but it doesn't have to have a budget to it. It can be
It doesn't need to have a budget to it, but I think we just want to be careful of not having a committee that doesn't have a very specific charge that could just carry on and not necessarily be a very productive committee. So we want to make sure that
Yes,
that
they're
there's
right. I
a-
just think it's going to be longer than a task force.
Yep.
Because I think it's going to end up taking, but he said like a year and a half to 2 years to even get it to a point.
Yeah, but I think the main thing, it has to be focused, and they have a certain mission to do, and they have a
Yep.
timetable in which to present to the planning board and town
Agreed.
council.
Agreed.
So, I mean, there'll be like a Gantt chart for a whole year on what the duties are and what they should be presenting, and the dates that they have to present.
I think it's important for that committee or whoever is responsible for the groundwater ordinances to use, as Pierce indicated, the grants available to hire professionals to make these types of decisions, because
Yep.
I'm certainly not a water specialist, but, somebody with a lot of letters after their name that studies water is
Yeah.
probably someone we want advising the town on where we should or should not be going.
Yeah, it'd be, I think, between engineering and, hydrogeology. Also some chemistry in there, too. So I think we've made an accomplishment, or a step anyway, so certainly we'll be working, I think Marge, Colleen, and I will coordinate things along with the chair of the town council. And what we'll need is the committee with a specific charge, and what levels of expertise we'd like to see on that committee. So I think we want to move fairly quickly. That's where the focus has got to be, because otherwise they're going to be all over the place and not accomplishing anything.
We'll get moving.
Okay. Next item we have on our agenda, and everyone's welcome to stay, is the capital improvement plan presentation. And actually by statute, the planning board is responsible for a capital improvement plan, which is a 6-year period. This forms part of the budgeting for both the town council, the town side, and also the school board, and the budget committee is also involved. I certainly want to thank Steve Bro, who's the chair of our CIP committee, John Farrell's vice chair, Jen Ganem from the school board, and I understand Jen has resigned, Jake Butler from the planning board, and Bruce Hallowell from the planning board. So that was the committee, and also a very able staff, especially Amy Kizak, who put this together, and Colleen, Justin Campo, and Peter Currow, and Peter's here, so you haven't fallen asleep yet, have you, Peter? Wait till we get to those school numbers. So, Amy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you pointed out, this is an advisory document that's a 6-year financial planning document to help guide the town council, school board, and budget committee in the budgeting process. It also helps to inform the public on planned improvements. The CIP committee is appointed by the town council. They review the submitted projects, and then they make priority recommendations to the planning board in the CIP plan. This year's process, with the town council passing the Taxpayer Relief Act of 2020, there were no town projects submitted. That resolution states that there shall be no townside projects prior to the fiscal year 2024. In addition, with the COVID-19 global pandemic going on, impacting the completion of the school facility 10-year master plan, the projects and priority rankings from the 2022-2027 CIP were carried forward and moved out 1 year. It's important to note that these school projects are placeholder projects only. It's to give the school district a chance to finish the school facilities master plan, and then they'll have a better idea of what their needs are going to be for future CIP plans. If you have any questions, please let me know.
Any questions from the, I see Peter, so I'm waiting to see what the board has any questions. I don't see any hands up, so, Jeff?
Sure. I have a question regarding kind of the 10-year school plan, and Peter, you might.
Oh, okay, Peter.
Malik.
And understandably, obviously, we've all lived through with the COVID-19 pandemic, living through it. And apologies if I've missed this, but what work has already been done on it, and when do you anticipate completion of that plan?
What's been done on it is the assessment of the buildings as they exist today. So the architects and engineers, along with Trident, went through each of the buildings and identified deficiencies in all the buildings, either HVAC, code, structural, so forth and so on. So they gave the analysis. I think, did they get the packet that was?
They did not get the handout or the PowerPoint from our
Okay, so I'll send it to you and you can.
I have it, I can forward it on to them.
Okay, so there's a PowerPoint that was presented to the CIP by Trident and LBA that laid out the deficiencies and what they saw in the buildings as they exist today. Like I said, it's more like on HVAC, plumbing, structural, in areas that are outdated, and either by code or simply by it doesn't fit the educational plans or programs that are currently being used, that the buildings are currently being used for.
Okay.
So from there, I can say this, I think. From there, we need to overlay or overlap what the future educational programs would like to be going forward. And I think we all know that the first question that has to be answered would be, what are we doing with the kindergarten program? Because I think that starts the whole ball rolling. Are you gonna keep it at Moose Hill? Are you gonna dissolve them into the buildings? Are you gonna have full-day kindergarten? Are you gonna have half-day kindergarten? So until that elephant gets resolved, I would think pretty much the grades 1 to 12 pretty much stay as they are with some changes with the use of technology, so forth and so on. But you need to figure out what you're gonna do with that, and then everything else kind of falls into place.
So just to kind of clarify that, so obviously the full-day kindergarten discussion is at the school board level. That's active discussions and so
It
forth.
will be once we get through a couple other issues, yes.
Okay, and probably still with a plan potentially of having this year, that decision.
That decision will probably take several months to go through. The board go through probably several. I would expect several. I'll use the word not workshops, but public meetings where parents would be involved and a presentation as to why they chose A or B or C, and then get input from the public. If the consensus is full day, then of course there's like, it's the old if, when, else. If you want to go full day, do you want to keep it at Moose and expand that building? Or do you want to do something with the elementaries and put kindergarten in that building? Do you want to do that and kick the 5th grade into the middle school? All those, there's a whole bunch of what happens when. So until those questions are kind of answered, or at least get started, it's kind of difficult for them to start looking at what you want to do with the buildings facility-wise to match the educational programs that you want to deliver.
Okay. Yeah, no, and thank you. That's, obviously very helpful. The second, the HVAC aspects, obviously, I think, COVID probably accelerated some of that
Correct.
research and review. What project of the holdover projects would that review kind of look into? Would that be a project, I think, 2? It would,
Well, let me.
the district school-wide renovations project?
Yep, well, the district-wide renovations was more like, if I remember correctly, for example, for those who have been around a while, we doubled the size of the middle school back in the 88.
A while back, yeah.
I'm sorry, 98.
Yeah, I think it
98.
was mid-90s? Yeah,
I was still here.
Yeah, you're on the town side, yeah.
So they doubled the size, or maybe even more, of the number of classrooms. But they didn't address any of the core. So your main office remained the same, your kitchen remained the same, your class was the same, your gym was the same, your library was the same. So you brought in a whole grade, but you didn't do anything to the core facilities. So that was one of them, and I think there's some other pieces that made up what's called district-wide. But to your point of HVAC, COVID, I think, has escalated that project. But the emphasis for more outside air, for more, I'll say, clean air of filters and so forth. So right now, there's 2 projects that we're working on that are facility-based. One is to convert the fixtures to touchless. That's more of a sanitation issue. The kids won't have to, touch it and whatever. Excuse me. And then there's a big HVAC project. There's 2 paths that we're looking at. We're running them simultaneously. One would not have to use COVID money, and one would use COVID money. So I think pulling out the HVAC from the 10-year plan because of the COVID situation and the emphasis on bringing in more fresh air, expanding the filters and whatever, and the emphasis on ventilation due to the COVID situation is probably going to we're probably gonna provide, or at least provide to the board, a plan for a huge HVAC improvement. Separate of, it's in that document, but because of COVID, we're gonna accelerate that. We'll make sure that whatever we do can be easily modified if it needs to be. But I think with all the school board meetings we've had, it's clear that ventilation is a number one issue to address, or at least help mitigate the COVID situation.
Yeah, thanks. Would those projects need to be reflected in the SIP at some
So
point?
they will be, so for this year, until that facilities master plan is completed, we don't know what those projects are, what the dollar figures are gonna be and how they're gonna break down. So these projects, the 4 projects that are in here, were in here, they were carryovers last year, they're actually in the
They're
CIP
2 years,
from 2 years ago.
yeah.
And so the reason that we're not just saying there is no CIP this year is because we didn't want to give the false impression that all the facilities are fine and everything's good and there's nothing on the horizon. So keeping these sort of as placeholders, we know the projects aren't real, these descriptions aren't real, the numbers aren't correct, because the school district is working on it. And so we didn't want to zero things out and give people the impression that there are no needs, but we can't really define them yet either.
And that's why the big descriptions of these projects are no longer in the document with them. These are just placeholders until they know what they are gonna need in the future.
And this, so we still have a plan, we have to have a plan. And that's important if we ever have like growth management ordinance or, impact fees, that type of stuff. But also, it's a tool for the board to plan the infrastructure that's needed for the future.
So having dovetailed that conversation, there was 2 things I was gonna say. One of the board members, I can't remember anything, Bob Slater, has asked the board and got permission from the board to accelerate, to use that word again, the construction of a new district office. I think everybody knows we're leasing with the address 6A Kitty Hawk, and there's a 10-year contract. He has asked permission from the board, got permission, and we're taking that little piece out of the 10-year plan and accelerating it all by itself. And the idea, the hope, is that we can fast-track this with LBA. What LBA is Lanier, LaValle, Bernier Associates, which is the architects, along with Trident, and have a structure and a plan and a funding in place for this March vote to construct a 2-story, right over here, we kind of left the window, kind of coming back, 2-story district office that would kind of mimic what it looks like here. So if somebody looked outside, you'd hopefully not know that this was an add-on to the building. And then in a year or 2, move from 6A back to the area that we once were. That is not in the CIP. That was done pretty much as the CIP committee was wrapping up that little idea of accelerating it. The magic of this is we believe with the interest rates for municipalities and school districts being around 2%, we believe that the annual bond payments will probably be a smidgen higher than what the lease payments are now for 6A Kitty Hawk. But of course, like everybody knows, you are buying something as opposed to just paying leases for rent. And remember, it was always designed to be a lease for 10 years, maybe a little bit more, to figure out what we want to do with the schools and to figure out what we want to do with the district office. So this is probably a couple of years earlier than what was originally planned, say 4 years ago. But you have the opportunity, you have the vacant area available, and the location. We have never argued the location. We've always thought this was one of the premier places to put it for a whole bunch of reasons.
Yeah, and I was definitely glad to see that somewhat accelerated. Looking forward to seeing, you know, the financial impact from a public citizens, standpoint. But I think moving that to the center of town is, would provide valuable services to all of the community. If I'm registering my kindergartner, I don't have to drive 25 minutes from South Londonderry to the district office. So glad to see that project move forward. Mr. Chair, I'm all set.
Okay, anyone else? Deb?
Hey, Peter.
I'll look down this end next time.
I have a few questions. So on the kindergarten, you have a number of 38. Is that just building costs, or does that include adding more teachers and more assistants and more administration? Or is that just for the actual construction? Or a guesstimation to the
I have to think.
construction only?
I think it's just the construction costs. I don't think I would put, if it's a CIP document, I wouldn't put in the operating costs just yet.
Okay.
Don't forget your,
I just wanted to make
I
sure,
know,
because there's
so-
not a lot of description, so I just want to
right,
be
so
clear.
don't forget, the main issue with a full-day kindergarten is obviously the classrooms. I'm not trying to be funny.
There's no kitchen there, right?
But when you bring in a full-day program, there's a gym requirement, a library requirement, the caf and kitchen. Now, you can probably have a multi-purpose room, right? You don't need a separate kitchen and gym for kindergarten, but you need something with the caf and a library. So the core facilities become the predominant number, so to speak, or a much higher number than what you would like it to be, because you're moving from a half-day program to a full-day program.
Okay. So then on to the next one. So when you talk about the HVAC, and you said there's COVID money for that, so how much did you get as a school district for COVID funds? And how much have you used so far, and what did you use it on? Because to me, that would have been one of the first things I would have been thinking about, is using my COVID funds on HVAC. So I'm just looking at this because I heard him say it, and I just was curious about that, because that to me seems that it's something you have to do pretty much right away.
Let's see. I'm going to miss Lisa McKinney again. Just to let everybody know that on the 21st, we will have a agenda item on the school board regarding COVID funds. Remember, we received COVID money in like 4 different buckets, small amounts each time. To date, total, we've been awarded, I think it's $3.8 million. The last one, ESSER 3, that we were just awarded was 1.5. So we have used monies for filtration, air filters. If you remember, each classroom now has a HEPA filter in each of the classrooms. And we did do some HVAC work with the other 2 ESSER 2 grants. We also, if you remember, added 3 custodians at each elementary school for the sole purpose of, I'll call it a sanitation shift. Did nothing but sanitize the buildings when the buildings left. But we also remember we had a lot of extra learning that we had to put in. We had a math academy this year that was in addition to what the normal summer school was. And we had a variety of issues we had to deal with over the school year. Because keep in mind, we were almost running a parallel school.
I understand.
So there were some costs dealing with that,
I was
not
just
just
trying to get
facility.
a fix on how much of the HVAC you've already done and what more needs to be done, and I'm just looking for that comparison.
We're about,
and I know this isn't a
we're
budget
about,
meeting.
We're about a
so-
week short of being able to identify, or 2 weeks short of identifying what the HVAC project will look like.
Okay. And so then on the high school gym, the turf and fields, when was the last time that was done? Didn't they just have repairs not too long ago on the fields?
We do annual work in the fields, okay? What this is
Whether they
referring
need it or not, or is there an actual need, or?
every year.
Okay.
What that's referring to is you need to remember, the gym has never been finished. Gym's never finished. There's a whole piece that.
Yeah,
was-
because the
was-
auditorium was supposed to
No,
go.
no. When the gym was designed, that little parking lot to the left,
Yep,
that's supposed to be building. That's supposed to be a multi-purpose room. The weight room, the weight training room was supposed to be over there. There was supposed to be a suspended track. If anybody goes to Winnicott,
yep, I've seen it.
the Winnicott gym,
Yep.
that's our gym. We just haven't finished it. They took
Okay.
the same plans and built it. What the field is a turf field. So it's not fixing fields, it's implementing, whatever word you want to use, a turf field.
You're gonna put in AstroTurf on the football field?
Not
Isn't
me.
it already there?
Not me.
Again, Deb, these
I
right now
underst-
placeholders, so they're
I
not
understand.
until
But
the plan's done.
I mean, those are at least four priority. I was
And of
curious
course, the
about the other
auditorium.
two. So the other one, I was at this meeting with you. The number here says 4 million, and we discussed it was 2.5 million
For what?
for the addition of the school. When I was at the meeting with you guys,
Yeah, don't forget.
I just
The
don't.
4 million was a standalone building.
Okay,
with-
so will
with
that
its
number
own-
be changed on here?
It will be.
To reflect
Yeah,
that?
you'll have that number no later than January 11th.
So it won't be changed in this CIP, that at this point, the committee has made a recommendation recognizing, as is written in here, that all of these projects are placeholders, so the descriptions and the numbers, we know are not real until we get that information from the school district, so.
But you'll get a real number, a different number by January 11th.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you answering all of those questions for me.
Yeah, and probably it'll go into next year's plan. 'Cause
Yeah.
We do this
Yes.
on a
Yes.
yearly.
Yeah,
Yep.
no, I know.
Yeah, and I think by the time next year, there'll be much more definitive and detailed what the 10-year master plan will look like, at least the first few years.
And so my last question has nothing to do with you, but it has to do with the population build-out. I'm struggling with where we got that number, how we're gonna deal with that many more people on the road in our towns that are already suffering with unbelievable traffic issues. That 13,000 more people is a huge number, and there is no way to fix that infrastructure at this moment in time.
That's from the master plan.
But that doesn't mean that it's correct, so I think that in the future really needs to be revisited and re-examined. The 13,000.
I think it's been looked at, I think, a while back, because it really started, years ago. I mean, even like, I think 3 master plans ago, it was looked at. That number has come down from what it used to be.
Well,
But it's the available land that we have. It's all based upon the available land that we have and what can be developed.
Well, and my fear is that you have people coming in and saying, but this is what you said you wanted to build out, so this is what you should build out because it's in the master plan. Doesn't mean it's correct anymore. I mean, I was on the last 2 master plans,
No, it's-
and that was an issue.
It's not in the master plan, it's taken from the master plan, it's in there.
I understand that, Art. I'm just saying, I think the number really needs to be re-looked at, because getting to that 37,000 people in this town, that's more than Derry.
And that's not, so that number from the master plan is not a goal to reach. That is based on
Based on
the zoning that was
usable
in place
land,
at that
and
time.
I totally understand
what
all
the
of
max
that, what you're
projection
saying, but
was.
how many times have we heard people come in here and say, but it says in your master plan, this is what we want to do?
Those numbers are not in the
I think it's
master
clear,
plan.
it doesn't say in the master plan that we want to achieve a population of 37,000, or that's
No, but it
not.
says you can't handle.
It doesn't say you can handle
That-
that either.
The master
No.
plan doesn't even say that.
No.
I'm gonna have to go back and look. I could have swore it had it in there.
It's,
But I'm concerned is just even seeing it in here. I really am, because I think the population, not that it wouldn't be wonderful to have all that money in taxes, I guess, but I don't think that our infrastructure, our water, our roads could handle that increase at all.
That's the purpose of that, because what it says is what we'd have to add for infrastructure to handle that. If we can't handle it, then it can't, that population cannot be achieved.
Okay,
That's a town council question.
all right. I'll say it. I don't have a I'll say it to town council. I looked at it and was like, I'm looking at population build out and I was reading it and it seemed to me that that was where we wanted to be.
Yeah, that's where policy starts, is with the town council.
Okay, thank you.
Deb, don't ever say we never agree, because I agree with you. That didn't have anything to do with me.
I've never said we didn't. We do
I know
every
that.
now
But
and
it-
then.
but
We're
that
just
had nothing to do with me.
alone.
You gotta keep track of that when you agree.
Wow.
Okay, any more questions
Sorry.
on this end here?
Nope, I think
Nope.
that's it.
How about this end? Roger?
You're talking about the Moose Hill School, which I'm very familiar with because my wife works there. When you're planning on.
See, we have something in common.
Oh, well, okay, good. That was built originally to have a second floor. Is that what you're looking at to expand, or?
It was built to be a middle school. If you go in the corridors are,
Yeah.
it was built to have the lockers in the hallways. And the second floor is not in the front, but I'd say a third back
Yep.
was the second floor.
We did see a plan at one time
Right.
here.
If you build a kindergarten,
Yep.
you can't have a second floor. That's DOE code. They do not want kindergarten because of a potential fire. They don't want kindergarten kids
Going down
trying to
the
get down the stairs. So what you're gonna see is more of a push out. If you're looking at it, a push out to the left where the portables are, and a push out back where that playground is.
So I guess my real question is, we've got room to do an
Yes.
expansion there
Yeah.
without going
To the
up.
left will be where the kitchen, the gym, and all that is, and to the right would be, straight ahead would be more classrooms.
And my second question is on HVAC, which, are we looking into the electronic filter rather than they change the filters all the time type?
I don't know. It's above my pay grade. Oh, you know what? I'll when I get that answer, I'll give it to Art and he can pass it on to you.
Yeah, it's,
I understand.
they don't use them here.
Right.
But in the south, they don't change filter, even in their homes, they don't. They got a little electronic gizmo and it works.
Something to think about, I guess.
That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Anything else from the board? Do you have
With
anything,
the,
Bruce?
if the new SAU office was to get passed by the voters in March, would the school department be placing an additional capital improvement objective on the plan, or would it just remove one objective from the plan?
I think what we'll do is to satisfy the CIP plan. When it comes around to like next May, we would actually put the correct number and put it in as FY 2021, 22, so that everybody knows that in 21, 22 there was a construction of X for whatever, just so it's true, and then you could take off somewhere on that CIP a district office construction project.
All set? Okay. You have anything to do ahead, Steve? You guys work?
On the HEPA filters, when you got electronic ones, I have heard that electronic ones, you don't want to use those in the classrooms. You heard some situations of that. The HEPA filters are the way to go, that's what I was told.
That's what,
Just from buying them, we actually bought the same with our company I work with, we bought the same units that are in the classrooms. And I spoke with the rep and he explained the whole process to me, but that was what we wanted. Regarding the CIP, what about this whole water? Is that going to create any capital projects?
Not for this, but,
In the future.
yeah, in the future. Probably next
Yes.
year there could be.
I'm sure there will be future projects generated. If not capital projects, there would be, budgetary requests or warrant articles on whether or not their capital improvements would be to be determined.
I have two more things.
Okay, Peter.
I mentioned this before. Could the planning board look at the rating sheet, I think? Because if you look at the rating sheet, I'm not gonna use, I hate the word bias, because I hate the town versus school or whatever, but if you look at the rating sheet, they're more attuned to talk about public safety. Is this a public safety issue? Does this affect the safety of the, whatever?
Yeah, we talked about this last year.
And we don't,
It's,
I mean, we have COVID and we're dealing with health and safety of students today, but that's not what we're talking about. So it almost should be something along the line, does this accelerate the mission of the organization? So for town, it's public safety and whatever. For the school, it's education. Because when I'm looking at it, it says, does this accelerate the need of public health or safety? Nope. So I don't want to say that school gets screwed out of points, but I got to put 0 because
It's really a different.
whereas if you said, does it meet the health and safety, whatever, or the educational of the school, I can put it, yeah, it's a 4 or a 5 or whatever the number is. I'm just saying going forward, just to make it somewhat even. So if it's the mission, the core mission of the town, it should be the core mission of the school district.
Yeah, I think we understood, because I know we talked about it
Right.
last year at this time also. And I think since everything's just carried over,
Yeah.
nothing's really changed, and I think we've got to, take a look at the sheets that go out to the respective departments and boards, committees, and everything, looking for the capital projects.
And the reason why I bring it up, Mr. Chairman, this is my last one,
Yes.
and I want to thank you personally for all the years.
Oh. You're welcome. We've worked at this
We've
together.
known each other and worked together for 30 years.
Yeah, because Peter used to be the finance director for the town side before the school side. I've known Peter for, oh my God, it must be 35 years at least.
Yeah. So, one of my things as I'm leaving is to clean up some of the stuff. So if the board could take a look at that, so the new, whoever's here next year.
Yeah. It's good you reminded us, because all of a sudden when you start talking about it, I said,
Am I good?
Yep, we'll be having a public hearing on this on October 6th.
Yeah, I have it.
Yep, so we'll be redoing this and we'll get public input at that time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate the hard work.
Over the years.
Okay, we do have one more thing. And hope you noticed the 2020 census numbers that are in the CIP. And let me get to the right page here. This is a growth update memo. Colleen.
Yep, so this is just very briefly under other business. So in the past, and you do have this memo on your screens, I'll follow up by emailing it to you folks. So in the past, when we had a growth management ordinance in place, there was an exercise we went through annually to compare the growth in Londonderry versus surrounding communities, which was at that time to determine if the growth management ordinance would be triggered and building permits would be restricted. That's been off the books for at least 3 years now. So what we have done, though, is provide the planning board just with an update on the number of residential building permits, what's been happening in Londonderry versus surrounding communities. So so these numbers are looking back to the 2020 calendar year. So in that year, there were 123 new residential dwelling units constructed in Londonderry. So that's the total of new dwelling units, including accessory dwelling units, minus any residential demolition permits. So 123 new units. Unlike previous years, in this instance, 97 of those were for new single-family residents, 6 were for two-family residential units, and 15 were accessory dwelling units. There were no permits for multifamily residential dwelling units in 2020. There were permits issued in prior years for some of the other existing multifamily, but there were no new multifamily residential permits. So those 123 permits in 2020 were really driven by Cross Farm, Catesby Lane, Lord and Commons, new single-family development in Londonderry. So the growth rate was a slight reduction in 2020 from the previous year. We're at 1.25% versus the preceding periods. The residential rate was 1.49%. Compared to surrounding communities, Litchfield and Auburn had slightly higher rates of residential growth in that year. Other communities were quite a bit lower than Londonderry, but we're still high, but are we're seeing a downward trend in 2020. I guess it's 1 year. I won't say 1 year is a trend. We'll see what 2021 brings us, and we'll report back. But I'll forward this memo, and if anyone has questions, we'll be happy to follow up.
Yeah, we're under a 6-year moving average anyway, so
Yeah.
that's a good sign. I mean, things are slowing down. And who knows what the price of housing is, how that's going to factor into
I mean,
things.
everyone just sees anecdotally the housing market is insane right now. There's no other way to describe it. So the cost of housing, the inventory is just
A shortage of labor,
so-
shortage of materials, and which is affecting a lot of businesses.
So it's who knows what this next year will bring. But we'll report back.
We're still in COVID times, so anything can happen.
Colleen, could you tell me how many demo permits were given out last year?
I would need to look at, I say maybe it's less than 10, maybe 5 to 7, but I would need to check that and see. I can follow up with you, Ann, and let you know what that is. The number's in the town report, but I can verify that.
Okay, just because there's no demo delay committee meeting anymore.
Yeah, and so any of those demolition permits, the demolition delay still is in effect. So if it is a historic structure, if it's of a certain age, that demolition delay still is in place. So there, as to my understanding, there were no permits that required demolition delay that were issued. If a residential structure that's built in 1980 is demolished, there is no demo delay, but a permit is issued.
Okay, thanks.
How about the demolition delay committee? I know.
Sue Judry.
Yeah, because I know Sue Jodry, I think, is on it.
Well, I think it's, as far as I know, it was, there is no more. That's, I was wondering
That's
if one
administered through
could
the
be
building
started.
department, so I'm not aware
it's part of the building
of the committee
department.
composition or what the requirements are.
Yeah, 5 Chase Road, yeah, definitely. Right, and you did, and we followed through, and unfortunately it got demolished, so, 1742, that house. Shame.
I was inside of that house. It was demolished before they took it down.
I was in there too.
It was, that house was a very dangerous house. Unfortunately, it was unkept and it wasn't
The last 10
tended to.
years, yeah.
Yeah, which is a shame. There was a lot of cool stuff in there, but
Oh, yeah, I went through it. Took a lot of photos.
but I don't know if they could have even saved it, you know, it was just so bad.
But the problem was termites in
Yeah.
the beams in the basement, so.
Yeah, when you walk into a house and it's doing this.
Well, that's typical of the floors, but it did have some structure problems.
As long as
Because
you
you
don't go
brought
through the
some
floors.
people from Concord down there, took a look at it. and- Anyways,
I have one more question. So most of those houses that you mentioned, those were all what, 55 pluses? that Came in? I mean, the majority, I'm not all of them, but on that
So,
number you just gave us.
Of the 97 new single-family units, I would need to look and see how many of those were at Cross Farm. A number of them were
Curious.
at Cross
I
Farm.
know that there was a mix, and I just was
Yeah.
looking at the ratio.
There was a mix. I'd say I would need to look, and I don't want to guess at it. I'd say probably 50% were at Cross Farm, but I would need
That's
to,
what I
I
thought.
can
It was a
follow up
good,
and verify that.
yeah,
That's what I thought, it was a good chunk.
A good chunk of
Yeah.
it is, because we're over the multifamily hump. Now,
Thank
we get
God.
over the 55-plus hump, we can at least get normal. I think we've satisfied what we're required to do by statute, so.
Thank
Who knows what else the legislature is gonna plan to do to us.
Colleen, when they,
Stuff going on up there.
in Woodmont, when they build the new assisted living facility, does that count as one permit, or is that a permit for every apartment?
We haven't, so I would need to verify with the building department how they report that. And I would need to look and see like the assisted living, how that was quantified. The most recent one being the All-American, and see how they reported that. That was back in, I think, 2015. So that was just before
But I think
my
it's by
arrival. So I need
unit.
to look at that and see. I honestly don't know. My inclination is that we would be reporting those as residential dwelling units, but I would need to look and see, a unit per, there's only one permit issued and one CO issued, but usually the permit would say how many units are part of that.
And is that what this number is indicative of for 2020, is the number of building units issued, or the number of building permits issued?
The number of dwelling units. So this is number of dwelling units, but in this case, in 2020, there were no multifamily. In past years, when Wallace Farm or McGregor Cut, there is a permit for the building, but that permit has, 22 residential units attached to it. And so we would report the number of units being created. So that's what we track, is the number of units being created. So, and I'll verify if, for consistency with past practice, how we handled All-American Assisted Living, and we can certainly just report it out to the board separately so that you're getting the full details. I don't want to overinflate the numbers, but I also don't want it to seem like we're underreporting the number of new units created in town.
Party Forever was referenced back, I'd say 83, 84, 85. Those were over 400. So you can see what the rate of growth was, mid-80s. It was off the wall. And that's why we developed a growth management ordinance in 1988.
Wasn't Woodmont supposed to be like 15 or 17,000 people at full build out in 20 years?
1460 something like that.
I suspect they're gonna backload that because they haven't done much in the first 10 years.
I don't know.
But they've got a 20-year.
20-year build out, but
But that, I mean,
10
that's
years
their
into
time.
their 20
We never
years.
put a time limit.
They're halfway done.
But we never put a time limit on the
Yeah,
phases. So
right,
if we
yeah.
had said phase 1 has to be done in 5 years, then you would have saw activity.
Yeah, yeah.
If we had said phase 2 has to be done in 15 years, you know what I mean? We didn't
Yeah.
do that. We said you got 20 years to do this. I don't even know if there was there an
There's no
insurity
time limit.
bond
Oh,
on
they,
that?
yeah, they don't have a time limit.
Was
I
there
think.
an insurity bond on
There's
what they did?
the development agreement.
Well, a surety bond for,
Any of it?
well, there are performance bonds for, for the physical construction, but there's not I don't know what the surety would be
Guarantee
posted
that
for.
they're gonna fulfill what they said they were gonna do. So like, when a building is being put in, right, and they start construction, and you're asked to put money in an escrow
Yes.
account to make sure that you fulfill what you say you're
They
gonna
do that for the individual site plan approvals, but that's not in place for the overall
Okay, so
master
he has
plan.
no money tied up in it, so he can take his time.
Yeah, I mean, the money they have tied up is their
It's not
private
exactly
infrastructure
happening
investment.
fast, so.
So,
Well, I mean, I'm just,
So, I mean, the 20 years is gonna be easily 40 years. That's
Could be.
my prediction.
it could be.
I mean, it's at a pace I think that the town can handle quite easily. And the comments I hear from people is, what's taking them so long over there? So,
It's a lot of open
I don't
space.
know. Yeah. So, any other business? Seeing now, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn, Mr. Chairman.
Motion to adjourn. I heard something down there.
Second.
By Bruce. Second by Bruce. All those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed,
Stay home.
leave too.